Every night I heard slow, deliberate footsteps walking across my ceiling. The building had no apartment above me until one humid night, something pushed open a door in my ceiling. My name is Sam. I was 28 when I moved into the top floor walk-up. The kind of place you take because your life is a series of compromises, and the rent is half of what a decent neighborhood would charge. 6 rooms folded into a single crooked rectangle, a kitchenette that had seen better decades, a shower that leaked when you leaned too hard on memory. I'd come here with 2 suitcases and a heart that still hurt in new ways after a breakup that had shredded plans, expectations, and the illusion that I was in control. For months, I lived on thrift store furniture, frozen dinners, and the dull hum of late-night television, trying to stitch myself together without anyone watching the work. The apartment was cheap for a reason. The floors complained in the middle of the night, sighing under the weight of old beams. Pipes clicked and released pressure like a tired throat. Neighbors pounded and complained about everything from the smell of curry to the volume of the radiator. Above all the practical flaws, though, there was intimacy to it, a place that felt like the first real space it had to myself in years. That intimacy meant I noticed small things: an off-key clock, the way light bent through the blinds. And when the first footsteps started, I told myself I would notice too much, because that was part of healing. You learn to equate vigilance with safety. At first, the noises were easy to explain. I'd lie awake and hear a slow, patient pace overhead. 5 steps, a pause, 5 steps back. It was a rhythm people learn to ignore in old buildings. I told myself it was the roof settling, raccoons, or the old tenant they sometimes mentioned in rumors. The kind of anonymous presence you slot into a story to make the creaks understandable. I imagined a pair of shoes scuffing across floorboards that had been worn by decades of feet. It sounded like someone crossing a very small apartment, which was how I convinced myself no person lived above me. The building had no additional unit, just an attic and a seal-it-off maintenance. Crawl space, the landlord liked to claim, was only for inspections. The noises were infrequent, and I let them be at first. The nights were humid, and sleep comes easier when you rationalize everything. I had a ritual: chamomile tea, 2 pages of a book, the fan oscillating like a slow breath. Sometimes I would fall asleep listening to the footsteps, letting them become a form of white noise. The rational part of me filed it away as old house noises and moved on. Then things started dropping through Dot. It didn't happen all at once. The first object was small, a plastic toy car, the kind with chipped paint you pick up at the bottom of a cereal box. It hit the countertop with a soft, yet undeniably deliberate thunk one afternoon as I was rinsing dishes and looking out at the city. At first I laughed. Must have been from the neighbor's kid, I told myself, though I had no kids in the building and hadn't seen children in months. I put the car in a jar with pennies and a stray ticket to a movie from 2 summers ago, making space on a shelf for tiny, inexplicable things. I told myself that was that. The second object was worse, because it wasn't random. It was a crayon drawing, folded in on itself like a secret. The paper was thick and old, the colors pressed with the guilty confidence of a small hand. It was a child's stick figure house, sun in the corner, a red scribble that might be a tree. At the bottom, in shaky letters, a name, Peanut. Only my mother and my grandmother had called me that, a nickname I hadn't heard in years. I hadn't told anyone I was moving here. I hadn't mentioned Peanut to anyone in months. The paper smelled faintly of dust and something else I couldn't place, maybe attic wood or the memory of crayons melted in a pocket on a summer day. That was when amusement became something colder. I took the drawing and flattened it against the counter, trying to arrange my thoughts into plausible scenarios. A prank, someone with access to the rooftop dropping things for fun, a misplaced craft package from a neighbor who thought I had children. But nothing fit. The building's landlord was a man named Hal, who owned a dozen other properties and perfected the art of aloofness. When I called to ask about things falling through the ceiling, he was breezy, the sort of voice that suggests trouble belongs to someone else. No one lives above you, he said. Attic's empty. Old insulation, sure. You probably had mice. Take care of it yourself. He did not come to inspect. He did not offer to patch cracks. After the drawing came other small, personal things. An old button from a coat I hadn't worn since college. A crumpled corner of a ticket to an art show my ex. And I once attended. A single, faded photograph of me as a kid with a gap-toothed smile. My arm around a dog that used to belong to my parents. They drifted out like confessions through the thin seams of the ceiling, landing on my counters and floors with an intimacy that felt invasive. Each item was something only I would recognize. Items tied to the most private shelves in my memory dread settled in modestly at first, like dust. Then, in the small hours when the fans oscillated but could not cool the air, the footsteps came with a peculiar precision. They no longer sounded like random passing. They matched me, the cadence, the slight unevenness in the gait from habit sounded identical to the way I walked when I was tired. After work, my feet tend to drag a fraction, the left toe catching before the right. Over time, lying awake with the ceiling a shadowed plane of plaster and old paint, I could map my own steps across it. Each pause coincided with a moment I would stop, look at a photograph, or think about a difficult memory in the dark. It was as if someone had rehearsed my nights, stepped through the same emotional rooms I had been avoiding. I started to keep a notebook by the bed, where I recorded the times the steps happened, the objects that subsequently appeared, and the small, ridiculous details like whether the hum of the refrigerator pitched higher afterwards. I grew absurdly careful. I stopped leaving food out. I moved fragile things away from counters. I taped over cracks where paper could be shoved through, and even bought mesh covers for the small vents, as though I could seal off the apartment from the past with duct tape. And denial sleep grew patchy and thin. I would drift and wake as if someone were paging through my dreams. I began to notice missing hours, nights where I would fall asleep at 9, but wake with the city already brushing its teeth at dawn. With no recollection of the middle, I dismissed those gaps as stress. We all misplace time when we're recovering, but the objects persisted. The nickname on the drawing whispered like a fossil record, something that had been stored away. And then, for reasons I didn't yet understand, was being returned. People think their homes are private by virtue of walls and locks. They are wrong. Sometimes privacy is an emotional construct, and the real breaches are the ones fashioned by memory. I began to feel watched by my own past, observed by the version of me that collected small things and held them like secrets: the footsteps, the items, the tilt of the rhythm. They made my life feel less like a place I inhabited and more like a stage set, arranged for someone who knew me better than I knew myself. One night, when the sky outside was heavy with the threat of rain, and the city smelled like wet asphalt, something else fell. It wasn't an object at first, but a sound, a thin, deliberate scrape against plaster that ended above my bed. The sound was followed by complete stillness, a silence so dense it felt like a held breath. My phone by the pillow read 2 in the morning. The fan had stopped. The apartment held its breath with me. I lay there, freezing under the weight of the night, and listened. The footsteps, when they began, were slower, each one a decision rather than movement. They paused directly above where I slept, for the first time aligning not just with my gait, but with me, my body, my decisions, my failures. For the first time, the sound was not a mystery that could be explained away with pipes and pests. It felt patient, like someone waiting for permission to be noticed. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat upright, arms wrapped around my knees, the drawing peanut tucked discreetly under my thigh like talisman against whatever was moving above me. Dawn stretched like a promise I didn't want to accept. The air grew thinner, the city roared awake, and I kept hearing echoes of the footsteps retreating across the ceiling. They left behind a new kind of silence, one that hummed with possibility and a terrible, intimate anticipation. Obsession started small and then took over. I told myself I was being rational. There are explanations for every creak in an old building. But rationality is a poor defense against the kind of noise that knows your schedule. I bought a cheap digital camera from a pawn shop and propped it on the bookshelf facing the ceiling above my bed. I taped a little voice recorder under the nightstand. I bought extra locks for the front door and measured the hinges on the attic hatch with a flashlight and a tape measure, as if precise numbers could make the unknown less threatening. I went through the footage first, of course. The camera died halfway through the first night. Its battery light blinked to life at 3 in the morning and showed a minute of static and then a smear of movement like a shadow drifting across plaster. The voice recorder caught nothing at first, but for the ordinary sounds of the building: pipes, distant televisions, the scuff of a neighbor going out for work. On the second night, the recorder picked up a rhythm, slow, measured steps pacing over the ceiling directly above the bed. They were not the quick, skittering noises of rats or the light taps of settling wood. They were intentional. They matched the cadence of a person walking in a slow circle. When I showed the footage to my landlord, he smiled like someone telling a joke. He had already told 100 times. "No one lives above you," he said. And then, almost casually, "That hatch has been sealed for years. Used to be an old storage loft. Kids would say there were ghosts up there, but we sealed it during the renovation. You must be hearing the building settling." But there were fresh scratch marks around the edges of the hatch pale, angry gouges in the paintwork I had never noticed until I was looking for them. The landlord shrugged and left me with his shrug like a bad alibi. I stopped sleeping. I set the camera to record every night and left 2 batteries on the dresser so it couldn't die. I stopped seeing friends because every plan was an invitation for the footsteps to find me while I wasn't ready. I started timing the noises, logging them with the precision of someone trying to map a heartbeat. The footsteps came more often, sometimes 3 nights in a row, then a quiet week, then a single drag step that woke me at 4 in the morning and made every hair on my arms prick awake. With alarm, I invited Jenna to stay over. She was the only person I trusted to call me out if I started to unravel, practical, blunt, and steady. She brought coffee, an extra pillow, and a worn children's book with a yellowed cover she picked up from a charity shop because she said it looked appropriately spooky without being ridiculous. She scoffed at the recorder and the camera, but she agreed to stay. We made a game of it, sleep and see. I didn't tell her about the toy car or the drawing with my family's nickname. I wanted her reaction to be uncontaminated. We watched a movie until we couldn't keep our eyes open. Jenna fell asleep with the book on her chest and the lamp still on. I took the camera down, double-checked the batteries, and set the recorder under the pillow so it would be as close to the ceiling as possible. I slept, if you could call it that, in a kind of tense half-awareness. At 2:13 a.m., the building made a settling sigh, and at 2:19, a single slow step passed above the kitchen. I didn't wake, Jenna didn't wake. But at 302, something shifted. The steps became an even, purposeful tread and moved from the kitchen toward the bedroom. They stopped. Silence can be its own kind of scream. After the steps stopped, the air felt heavier, like a room that has been holding its breath. Jenna made a little noise in her sleep and turned over. I lay rigid and counted heartbeats and listened for anything. The recorder captured the hush and then a faint sound, like someone humming under their breath. It wasn't a song I could place at first, just a soft pattern of notes. But But then the first line of the lullaby my mother used to sing came through the clip, muffled, off-key, as if it had been sung from far away. My hands went cold. Jenna sat bolt upright. She swore softly and then very quietly whispered, "Do you hear that?" I played the recording back on my phone. The hum was there, and faint beneath it, the scrape of something being dragged across wood. Then, shoved through a slim crack in the ceiling, came a small square of paper. It fluttered down like a moth and landed on my nightstand. I picked it up with numb fingers. It read, in a shaky hand I didn't recognize, but whose loops felt oddly intimate. Remember, we stared at the word like it was a prophecy. "Who wrote that?" Jenna asked. There was no answer. We checked the footage together. The camera had captured nothing of a person entering the frame during those minutes, just a dim smear. And then the paper descending in a slow, impossible arc. The ceiling was old plaster paper, shouldn't have found a way through without a hole. And yet, under the hatch's lip, there were hairline gaps where paint had cracked away. They were small, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. And through one of them, a thread of shadow moved. That night, Jenna left early, shaken. She hugged me without a word and drove off in the blue gloom. I stood in my kitchen under the patched light and felt both absurdly exposed and desperate to know. I went to the library the next morning and lost myself in the municipal records room. The building, it turned out, had a history. There was an entry from decades ago listing it as housing for a child care facility attached to a municipal orphanage. The address matched. There were photographs, black and white, of children clustered on the fire escape. A stern matron at the door. A small scrawl on the back of one photo that read attic playroom. I thought of the toy car and the crayon drawing I had found months earlier, and how the nicknames scrawled across the drawing matched something only my family used for me. I thought of the lullaby and the note. The records were dry and bureaucratic, but they suggested a history of children and a space above the top floor used for play. There were mentions of sudden disappearances across a span of years, couched in the bland language of minutes and municipal reports. Children unaccounted for during transfer. And nothing that read like a scandal, only paperwork that had been filed away and forgotten. That evening, I found I couldn't keep my hands off the hatch. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and stared at it until my eyes blurred. I pressed my ear to the cool plaster and heard, very faintly, an answer to the lullaby humming from before, notes that seemed to echo and then repeat in a loop. There were times I would wake up in the morning with things in my pockets I didn't remember putting there. A cheap plastic whistle, a folded scrap of crayon paper with a child's doodle of a sun. Nights disappeared. There were at least 4 times, judging by timestamps in my phone, when I had been out of conscious memory for hours, and then back in bed with no recollection of how I had got there. The next night, the footsteps returned, heavier, deliberate, pacing like someone mapping the room from above. They paced closer and closer, until they hovered over my head, then stopped, so close I could hear the shallow breath of the ceiling itself.